what life was really like for enslaved people in the Viking Age across the windswept fjords of medieval Scandinavia, where longships carved their paths through icy waters and warriors sang of honor and glory. There existed a hidden world of human bondage that contradicted every romanticized notion of Viking society. Beneath the gleaming mail and heroic sagas lay a brutal economic system built upon the systematic exploitation of captured souls, men and women torn from their homelands to fuel the prosperity of Norse civilization. These were the thrall, the enslaved people whose labor built Viking halls, whose sweat filled Viking coffers, and whose suffering remained deliberately erased from the glorious tales that echoed through the ages. This is the investigation into the forgotten lives of enslaved people during the Viking Age, a story of human resilience in the face of systematic dehumanization that reveals uncomfortable truths about one of history's most celebrated warrior cultures. Through careful examination of archaeological evidence, contemporary accounts from both Norse and foreign sources, runic inscriptions, legal codes, and the testimony preserved in medieval chronicles, we reconstruct the daily reality of those who lived in bondage throughout the Scandinavian world from the 8th to the 11th centuries. Today, we explore the harsh economic foundations of Viking prosperity, examining how the slave trade became the invisible backbone of Norse expansion, how enslaved people were captured, transported, and exploited, and how their resistance and adaptation shaped not only their own survival, but the very structure of the societies that claimed to own them. Using evidence from excavations across Scandinavia, Russia, and the British Isles, along with the detailed observations of contemporary chroniclers like Ahmad ibn Fadlan and Irish monastic records, we piece together a comprehensive picture of slavery in the Viking world that challenges romanticized narratives while honoring the memory of those whose voices were systematically silenced. The foundation of Viking slavery rested upon a sophisticated network of raids, conquest, and human trafficking that stretched from the monasteries of Ireland to the slave markets of Constantinople. Archaeological evidence from sites like Hedeby and Birka reveals extensive slave trading infrastructure, including specialized holding facilities and evidence of large-scale human trafficking operations that supplied labor throughout Northern Europe. Contemporary accounts from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describe how Viking raids specifically targeted settlements for human capture, with chroniclers noting that raiders often showed more interest in securing captives than in seizing treasure, recognizing that human beings represented the most valuable and renewable resource available to their expanding society. The process of enslavement began with the trauma of capture, documented in vivid detail by surviving accounts from monastic chronicles across Ireland and Britain. The Annals of Ulster record how Viking raiders employed systematic terror tactics designed not just to subdue resistance, but to psychologically break captured populations before transportation. Victims were typically bound with iron shackles, archaeological examples of which have been discovered at numerous Viking Age sites, and forced to march to coastal areas where they awaited transport aboard overcrowded ships. The mortality rate during these initial stages of enslavement was catastrophically high, with some estimates suggesting that only half of those initially captured survived the journey to slave markets. Contemporary legal codes from Iceland and Norway provide detailed insight into how Viking society classified and regulated enslaved people, revealing a complex hierarchy that determined every aspect of a thrall's existence. The Gragas, Iceland's medieval law code, defines enslaved people as property equivalent to livestock, establishing legal frameworks that denied them basic human rights while creating elaborate systems for their ownership, transfer, and punishment. These laws reveal that thralls could be bought, sold, traded, or given as gifts without any consideration of family bonds or personal relationships, with legal texts specifically addressing how to divide enslaved families among multiple owners and how to handle the offspring of enslaved women. The daily reality of enslaved life in Viking society encompassed every form of brutal labor, from the most dangerous mining operations to the most intimate domestic servitude. Archaeological evidence from sites like Trelleborg and Firkat shows that enslaved people performed the backbreaking work of constructing Viking fortifications, with skeletal remains revealing the physical toll of constant heavy labor. Bone analysis of individuals buried in clearly servile contexts shows patterns of repetitive stress injuries, malnutrition, and signs of violence that paint a grim picture of working conditions. Women faced particular horrors, as legal texts and saga literature make clear that sexual exploitation was considered a natural right of ownership, with enslaved women serving not only as laborers but as concubines who could be used and discarded at will. The economic importance of slave labor to Viking society becomes clear when examining the archaeological record of Norse settlements across their territorial expansion. Excavations in Iceland reveal that the initial colonization would have been impossible without substantial enslaved labor forces, as the clearing of land, construction of settlements, and establishment of agricultural systems required far more workers than the free population could provide. Similar patterns emerge from Viking settlements in Greenland, the Faroe Islands, and parts of Britain, where the rapid transformation of landscapes and the construction of substantial infrastructure depended entirely upon the systematic exploitation of enslaved populations. Arabic sources provide some of the most detailed contemporary observations of Viking slave trading practices, particularly through the accounts of Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered Viking merchants along the Volga trade routes in 922. His descriptions reveal how enslaved people were treated as commodities in international trade networks, with Vikings transporting captives from northern Europe to Middle Eastern markets where they could be exchanged for silver, spices, and luxury goods. These accounts detail the dehumanizing processes of slave markets, where people were examined like livestock, with their physical condition, age, and skills determining their market value. The resistance of enslaved people took many forms, from subtle acts of daily defiance to organized attempts at escape and rebellion. Runic inscriptions and saga accounts, though filtered through the perspectives of their oppressors, occasionally preserve evidence of enslaved people who fought back against their circumstances. The Egil's saga mentions enslaved individuals who attempted escape, while archaeological evidence from some sites suggests instances where enslaved people may have been killed to prevent uprising during times of social instability. The fact that Viking legal codes developed increasingly harsh punishments for enslaved resistance suggests that such resistance was common enough to require systematic legal responses. Archaeological evidence also reveals the complex social dynamics that emerged within enslaved populations, including evidence of community formation and cultural preservation, despite systematic attempts at dehumanization. Burial sites associated with enslaved individuals sometimes show evidence of maintained cultural practices from their original homelands, suggesting that enslaved communities found ways to preserve their identities and traditions even under the most oppressive conditions. Personal items discovered in these burials, though few and modest, indicate that enslaved people maintained networks of mutual support and found ways to acquire small possessions that provided psychological comfort and connection to their pre-enslavement lives. The gradual transformation of Viking slavery during the later medieval period occurred not through moral awakening, but through economic and social changes that made other forms of labor exploitation more profitable. The rise of Christianity in Scandinavia created new ideological frameworks that, while not eliminating slavery entirely, began to place moral restrictions on the treatment of enslaved people and encouraged manumission as a religious virtue. However, archaeological and documentary evidence suggests that these changes were gradual and incomplete, with enslaved labor remaining crucial to Scandinavian economies well into the high medieval period. Contemporary accounts from Christian missionaries working in Scandinavia reveal the complex relationship between Christianization and the end of Viking slavery. While church doctrine theoretically opposed the enslavement of Christians, it provided convenient loopholes that allowed continued exploitation of non-Christian populations. The gradual adoption of feudal agricultural systems provided alternative methods of labor control that achieved similar economic results while appearing more socially acceptable to increasingly Christianized populations. The international dimensions of Viking slavery extended far beyond Scandinavian borders, creating networks of human trafficking that connected Northern Europe to slave markets across the medieval world. Byzantine sources document the arrival of Viking merchants with Slavic captives, whose very name became synonymous with enslaved status in multiple European languages. The scale of this trade was enormous, with some historians estimating that hundreds of thousands of people were enslaved and transported through Viking trading networks during the height of the Viking Age. The legacy of Viking slavery challenges romanticized narratives that portray Norse society as uniquely egalitarian or progressive, revealing instead a civilization built upon systematic human exploitation that rivaled any other medieval society in its brutality and scope. The archaeological record makes clear that Viking prosperity, exploration, and cultural achievements were made possible by the systematic dehumanization of countless individuals who were reduced to property and exploited until death. As we confront this darker aspect of Viking civilization, we must acknowledge that the same culture that produced remarkable advances in navigation, poetry, and governance also created systems of human bondage that caused immeasurable suffering. The enslaved people of the Viking Age left few written records of their experiences, but their presence permeates every aspect of the archaeological record, from the construction of great halls to the clearing of agricultural land, from the workshops that produced Viking crafts to the ships that carried raiders across unknown seas. The story of enslaved people in the Viking Age reminds us that historical truth is often more complex and disturbing than popular narratives suggest, and that understanding the full human cost of past civilizations requires us to listen for the voices that were deliberately silenced. These men, women, and children, torn from their homes and forced into bondage, were not footnotes to Viking history, but fundamental to its very existence, and their suffering demands recognition, even as we acknowledge their resilience, resistance, and the communities they built despite systematic attempts to destroy their humanity.